Okay, so by the end of today, you all will be able to describe the classification systems and various applications of those classification systems. And the essential question, what is the classification system and why has it changed over time? So as we transition into this next unit, which is all about evolution, you need to think about how we describe these species and how we can describe one species' relation to another species. These classification systems allow us to place different species in different groups. And I use that word loosely, and you'll find out soon why. But in let's just call them categories based on shared characteristics. The more specific those characteristics are, the more closely related those two species are. So the title of today's lesson, as you all start to get ready to take your notes, is Classification System. The date is November 9th, 2020, and this is obviously day 1 of Unit 8. Okay. So scientists use an 8-level system to organize all living organisms based on common characteristics and evolutionary relationships. So we can see these 8 levels in this image. We can see the most zoomed out or the most general level is called a domain. Then we get a little bit more specific. We zoom in a little bit more, and that would be a kingdom. Then we zoom in a little bit more and get even more specific, and that's a phylum. More specific is a class. More specific is an order. More specific than that is a family. More specific than that is a genus, and then you've got a species. So in this specific example, the species we're most interested in is Ursus americanus, the American black bear. The American black bear is a part of the domain Eukarya. Now there are only, we'll talk about it, but there aren't many domains. The domain Eukarya obviously indicates that these are all organisms that are eukaryotic. They have a nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles. So we're familiar with what eukaryotes are. This black bear is a part of the Animalia kingdom. So the domain Eukarya can be further divided into Animalia species and plant species. Obviously, a black bear is an animal, so is a part of the Animalia kingdom. More specific than that, a phylum. So chordata, I don't exactly know what identifies something as a chordata as being a part of a chordata phylum, but I can see that we no longer have coral in this phylum. So there's got to be something involving respiratory systems. Then a class would be Mammalia. So now we're no longer considering reptiles, we're no longer considering birds, we're no longer considering fish, we're no longer considering amphibians. We're strictly talking about Mammalia, mammals in this class. Then more specific, an order, so carnivores versus herbivores or omnivores. We're talking about carnivores in this case. A family, this is Ursidae. Not exactly sure if that's the right pronunciation, but based on my Latin background, I'm gonna guess that it is. Then Ursus, these would be your bears more generally, and then the species would be the American black bear. So this is really cool because not only does it allow us to group things based on common characteristics, but it also gives us an idea of their evolutionary relationships. So evolutionarily, the species that are a part of this Ursus genus are much more closely related than, let's say, a black bear and a butterfly. A black bear and a butterfly are both a part of the Animalia kingdom, but they're not nearly as evolutionarily related as a black bear and a polar bear, or as a black bear and a brown bear, or even as a black bear and a cheetah. So as we learn more about species, as we learn more about how life can exist and where life exists, it causes us to change our classification systems. So new research, new biotechnologies, and new discoveries, because we do still discover new species, if you can believe that, these all change the way that we classify and describe species. And they help us to better understand how species are related to one another. Even if we discover something that is no longer living, so if we discover a new fossil, that also provides insight into how organisms are related to one another. So for example, we can see here, before 1753, we either labeled something as plant or as animal. We didn't really have any way of further classifying things. And even back then in 1753, we didn't know microorganisms existed. We had some idea that, there were small animals that existed, that were so small that we couldn't necessarily see them. But we didn't really know that unicellular organisms existed. We didn't describe things as being cellular at all. We didn't have a concept of a cell. Um, at that time, we thought that diseases were spread because of foul odors and because of, in some cases, we thought that people just had bile that was produced in their body, or blood that was produced in their body that was in some way maleficent. And so what they would do is literally just allow some of your blood to drain out, or they would put leeches on your skin and allow the leeches to, suck the blood out, thinking that that would remove whatever malady you were suffering from at the time. They didn't have any real knowledge of the fact that bacteria and viruses are actually what allow these sicknesses to pass from one person to the next. So this is an amazing example of how research, science, biotechnology has allowed us to better understand the world around us, and also allowed us to more accurately understand how species are related to one another. So please do write down all 8 of these levels of classification. Keep in mind that at the top, we've got the more general level of classification. And then at the bottom, as you move down the list, you get more and more specific. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Species is the most specific. Domain is the most general. Okay, this is, I guess it's probably my Wi-Fi connection, but that's not working. But there are plenty of ways to remember these levels of classification. Let's see, hold on. All right, so how I always remembered them, and I can send a message to the chat.
Isn't it there like a way of saying like did King Philip came to or order or something?
Would you say that again, Castro?
Alright, so last year I had Miss Cruz for Earth Environmental, and she said something about like there's like a way to remember saying did King Philip.
Yes. So you can come up with. I mean, I'm sure there are several. Um, what am I trying to say? What are these called? I don't. I can't remember what they're called. But the one that I've always used is "Do keep pond clean" or "Froggy gets sick." That's how I was taught. Or you could. One of my students several years ago came up with. Uh, I can't remember. It was something or fights get started.
Oh, I think there's one that says did King Philip come over for a good soup or spaghetti?
What does the D stand for?
Domain.
No, I mean what in your saying, what is the D? What word is the D?
Did
Oh, did
yeah did King Philip
King Philip come over
for good
for what?
for good spaghetti or soup, or it could be anything that's involved S. But I just said spaghetti.
King Philip come over for good spaghetti. Yeah, so you can come up with any list of these sentences. What is this called? Not an anagram, but not an acronym. I can't remember. I guess it could be considered an acronym, but this is always a good study method. If you need to try to remember a list of words, it's always a good idea to try to associate it with some type of sentence. Oh, a mnemonic. It's called a mnemonic. Mnemonic. Um, right? Let's see. Make sure that's correct. Oh, yeah, I misspelled it. Mnemonic. Okay. But yeah, this is just a clever way to help you remember the order of these levels. I got to think about the other one that says or fights get started. Something don't I can't remember. I'll think about it. So it would be pretty inconvenient if the only way we had to describe organisms is by listing out all 8 of these levels, because that would just require a huge memory and also a lot of time. And a lot of these words are in Latin, so you'd have to have a pretty strong knowledge of the Latin language, a pretty strong grasp on how you can pronounce Latin. So the other way that we classify and name these organisms is just by using what's considered their scientific name, which is just the species and the genus. So for human beings, the full classification would be all 8 levels: Eukarya, Animalia, Chordae, mammals, primates, hominids, Homo sapien. But we just shorten it to the scientific name and just consider it Homo sapien. So chordates are animals with backbones. That's good to know. So we call this scientific name binomial nomenclature. Just a fancy way of saying 2 words to name something. Okay. So when we start to think about this overall topic of our unit being evolution, it's really important that we can describe the evolutionary relationships between species. And what we mean is that species at some point, if you subscribe to evolution, for which it's a theory that for which there is a lot of evidence, and we're going to talk about some of that evidence in this unit. But if you subscribe to this theory of evolution, then you believe that in the distant past, so I'm not talking about 300 years ago, I'm not even talking about 10,000 years ago, I'm talking about a million years ago, and the distant past, many of the life forms that we now know exist on Earth existed as one common ancestor. And then over many, many thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, that singular common ancestor became split into multiple species, into a number of species. The reason for this happening is kind of complicated, but it happens largely for survival purposes. So instead of competing for the same resources, one species will branch off, and now they have access to another source of resources, and that might be food, that might be just space in general, that might be water, or that might be air, the air that they need to breathe. So instead of competing for a limited number of resources, by developing these different traits and then eventually becoming totally different species, they gained access to a number of different resources. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this unit as it relates to evolution. But these dichotomous keys, which we don't really have an example of one here, but you'll see it in the coming slides. And then these phylogenetic trees and cladograms are what actually allow us to visually display the relationships between species. So what we can see here is that a long time ago in the distant past, our common ancestor was a shark. That was at a time when life existed, almost solely underwater. Then that species branched off and became something more associated with a ray-finned fish. And then we developed into amphibians, which had the ability to live both underwater and outside of water, even if only temporarily. And then with the development of amniotic eggs, we developed into other species, right? So these phylogenetic trees and cladograms allow us to see what the relationship was many, many years ago. And then these dichotomous keys are sets of two statements that can be used to identify organisms. So you always start with the first set of the statement. So for example, here, if this is the species that we're looking at, we can see the physical characteristics, but we want to identify it with its scientific name. We look at the first set of statements. It says a solid coat. If it's a solid coat, then you go to the set of statements number 2. You go to set 2. If it's not a solid coat, then you go to set 3. In this case, we obviously are looking at a species that does not have a solid coat. It's got spots. So that means we go to statement set 3 down here. If it's striped, this says stripped, but if it's striped, then that tells us that the scientific name for the species is Panthera tigris. But it says if the species is spotted, then that tells us that that species is, I don't know how to pronounce this, but I'll give it a try. Acononyx jubatus, which we'll just call it H. So you've got to start with the first statement, the first set of statements. It's going to tell you if the species looks like this, then you need to go to set 2 or set 3 or set 4. And then you go to the next set. It might give you the scientific name, or it might ask you another question. Does this species have fangs? Go back to set 2, go to set 4, so on and so forth. So that's what these dichotomous keys allow you to do. They're going to tell you we call them dichotomous because they give you two choices. If it's this, then do this. If it's this, then do this. If it's this, well, then it must be this species. This is the scientific name. If it's this, well, then keep going to the next set. If it's this, well, then it's this scientific name. If it's that, then it's that scientific name. So it gives you two choices. Okay, so someone help me out here. We can see this species. We can see a picture of the species here. We start off with statement set number 1. Does this species have a solid coat or does it not have a solid coat?
Has a solid coat.
It does have a solid coat. So what should we do based on that information?
Go to step 2.
Yep, go to statement set number 2. So in set number 2, we're being asked, is it a smooth coat with a long tail and no mane, or is it a smooth coat with a mane? Which one?
A.
Yes, it would be A. The mane is that, that the bushy hair that surrounds a lion's head. So no mane here. We can also maybe barely see a long tail that's just kind of hanging down back there. So this would be Felis concolor, cougar. So those were dichotomous keys. Now we want to think about phylogenetic trees. The primary thing to know about these phylogenetic trees is that the closer they are on the tree, the more closely related they are. And the places where their lines intersect is where we know there's a common ancestor. So somewhere down here would be all of their common ancestors. They share one common ancestor, these 3 species. But then we can see they get branched off. And so species 3 branched off at this point. So now we end up with 2 different species. And then as time goes on and we're moving this way, we get to another fork in the road. And then in this case, species 2 breaks off and species 1 continues. So we end up now with a total of 3 different species. Okay, so it really does, you can read it like a timeline, and you should read it like a timeline. Sometimes on these phylogenetic trees, you will also see specific characteristics, and those characteristics are telling you what really differentiated the species. So again, way down here at the bottom, we would have some type of common ancestor. That common ancestor split off into 2 different species with the development of vertebrae, so with the development of a spine. That led to sharks, but then there also were another species that came out of that. But then that species develops bony skeleton. And so we see another splitting off, another branching off into different species. Then we see another splitting off with the development of 4 limbs. And then with an amniotic egg, then with hair, and so on and so forth. Eggs with shells. So the question here asks, which organisms are most closely related and which are the least. Let's just start with the least. That should be easy to see. Which organisms are the least closely related here?
The bird and the shark.
Yeah, the bird and the shark. They are the furthest away from one another in this phylogenetic tree. So they're the least closely related. Now, the most closely related is, you can't really tell here because they all seem to be about the same distance apart from one another. So yeah. Now, you're going to get plenty of practice with this using these cladograms. Can I have somebody tell me if the flip and flop practice link works now? It's on Canvas.
Mr. Ed,
Yes.
can I ask a random question?
Yes.
How do jellyfish evolve? Because some of them do reproduce sexually, but some of them like go in a cycle.
See, I have no idea off the top of my head, but let's see if we can find something. Hmm. That's a good question, Alicia. And there does appear to be a good amount of information at this website that I just sent the link to in the chat. Perhaps I can read through it tonight and see if there's any interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but we'll try to bring it into the class. It does look like one of the defining characteristics that distinguishes between jellyfish and other forms of life is called radial what did I just see? Radial symmetry versus bilateral symmetry. So radial symmetry implies that there is a circle, or some type of circular symmetry that radiates outward from some middle point. And so they are symmetrical from that middle point, just like a circle would be. Bilateral symmetry is what we know most humans to possess, right? We are mirrors of ourselves from a center line. And most forms of animal life follow that bilateral symmetry, but with jellyfish, they've got that radial symmetry. But that's an interesting question. I've never even really thought much about jellyfish, but they do appear to be a pretty unique life form and old life form. Has anybody been able to get through to the flip and flop assignment? Is the link working? Yes, no.
Can you repeat what you- I was in the back.
Yeah, I'm asking if anyone has gotten access to the flip and flop assignment because Ayana told me that the link was not working. I think I fixed it. But
It's a Google Doc, right?
yes.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Were we supposed to be doing something with the article as well?
What? Say it one more time, Ayana.
I said, were we supposed to be doing something with the article about the jellyfish?
No, no, that was sent basically to Alicia.
Okay.
It is now 11:36, so you all are good to go and enjoy your lunch break before third block. Ayana, if you'd like to